The air in the royal chambers of the Alcázar of Madrid that autumn of 1700 was a putrid symphony. A suffocating mixture of incense burned in a vain attempt to purify the impurifiable, the sweet and penetrating aroma of medicinal ointments that promised impossible relief, and the unmistakable, subtle but persistent stench of slowly decomposing flesh. In the heart of an empire that once boasted that the sun never set on its dominions, a man, barely 39 years old, was fighting his last, desperate battle against an invisible enemy that was consuming him from within. He was no ordinary man. He was Charles, second of his name, King of Spain and the Indies, the last male descendant of the powerful House of Austria in its Spanish branch, a monarch known by a nickname that whispered both fear and pity, the Bewitched. His body, a macabre canvas on which nature seemed to have rehearsed its cruelest whims, lay on the bed as the final and devastating testimony of a dynasty that had devoured itself, generation after generation, in a labyrinth of blood marriages. A king whose birth was celebrated as a miracle woven from shadows, and whose death, so often announced, feared, and even desired by some, was about to unleash a conflagration of steel, gunpowder, and unbridled ambition that would drown Europe in blood. Was his pathetic existence a cruel joke played by an unforgiving fate, the inevitable product of decades, centuries of unions forbidden by blood and discouraged by the most basic prudence? Or was he, as was whispered with dread in the gossip circles of the town and court, in the shadowy confessionals, and even in the offices of foreign ambassadors, a victim of dark arts, of an insidious curse cast by unknown enemies to break the Habsburg line and dismember its vast legacy? This is the chronicle of a death foretold, the autopsy of an end that was much more than the cessation of vital functions. It was the collapse of a symbol, the twilight of an era. Join me in uncovering the intimate details of this death, in scrutinizing the secrets that the marble of his tomb tried to seal forever, and in understanding why the last breath of this unfortunate king resonated with the force of a catastrophe. To decipher the tragedy that culminated on that deathbed, it is imperative to go back in time, to immerse ourselves in a Spain that, although still cloaked in the trappings of past greatness, was already showing the deep scars of a decadence that was seeping through every crack in its imperial structure. The Golden Age, with its literary and artistic splendor, had breathed its last breaths, and the ominous shadows of economic crisis, humiliating military defeats on European battlefields, and depopulation that turned vast areas of Castile into silent wastelands loomed over the peninsula. It was against this backdrop of stark contrasts, where the obscene opulence of the court coexisted with the endemic misery of the common people, that our protagonist was born. On November 6, 1661, in the sumptuous but cold halls of the Buen Retiro Palace in Madrid, Carlos was born, the fruit of the union between the already elderly King Philip IV and his second wife, Mariana of Austria, who was also his niece. His birth was greeted with a sigh of relief that bordered on collective despair. Philip IV, a monarch who loved the arts and pleasures but was deeply worn down by a long and troubled reign, had seen the Grim Reaper take his male heirs one after another. The continuity of the Habsburg dynasty on the Spanish throne hung by a thread as thin and fragile as the newborn's own health. From his first cry, which some chroniclers described as weak and pitiful, Charles showed a sickly constitution that would be his constant companion until his death. His life was feared for on countless occasions during his early years. Every fever, every bout of diarrhea, every infantile convulsion was greeted in the palace with panic and prayers. The chronicles of the time, always prone to courtly flattery, but unable to completely hide the harsh evidence, describe him as a rickety, pale infant, prone to endless colds and a host of ailments that defied the knowledge of the royal physicians. The root cause of so much physical misery? Today, genetic science offers us a clear answer: extreme inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs, in their obsessive desire to preserve the purity of their lineage and maintain the cohesion of their scattered and heterogeneous territories, had practiced for generations a policy of marriage between close relatives that today would seem aberrant to us. Uncles marrying nieces, first cousins uniting in marriage, a family tree that twisted around itself like a snake, concentrating and enhancing recessive genetic defects with each new generation. Charles was the culmination, the final and most tragic product of this dangerous game with the laws of nature. His coefficient of inbreeding was so high that it was equivalent to that of a child born of the union between siblings. The infamous Habsburg jaw, that mandibular prognathism so characteristic of the dynasty, manifested itself in him in such an exaggerated form that it made chewing and speaking extremely difficult, giving his face a melancholic and somewhat clumsy expression. His education, or rather lack thereof, was another determining factor in his unhappy fate. Fearing that any intellectual effort might aggravate his already precarious health, his tutors and his own mother overprotected him to the extreme. He grew up wrapped in cotton wool, surrounded by a cloud of doctors more concerned with keeping him alive than preparing him for the arduous tasks of government that awaited him. It is said that he was slow to utter his first words, that he barely learned to read and write with any fluency, and that his intellectual curiosity was systematically stifled. His childhood world was reduced to the labyrinthine confines of the royal alcazar, an endless succession of cold corridors and sumptuous but soulless halls, where suffocating protocol and whispered intrigues were the daily food for his spirit. His father, Philip IV, the Planet King, died when little Charles was only 4 years old. A monarch who had loved art and patronized geniuses such as Velázquez, but who had presided over the inexorable decline of Spanish power, left his only surviving son a poisoned inheritance, a vast but exhausted empire. The regency then fell to his widow, Queen Mariana of Austria, a woman of deep and sincere religious devotion, bordering on fanaticism, intelligent but politically inexperienced and therefore easily influenced by her circle of favorites and confessors. Under her tutelage, the Spanish monarchy sank even further into paralysis and inaction. The Queen Regent, fearful of any change that might destabilize the precarious balance, clung to often mediocre and rapacious advisers, such as the German Jesuit Juan Everardo Nithard, her confessor, who soon earned the deep hatred of the Castilian high nobility for his arrogance and his status as a foreigner. The young Charles grew up in an atmosphere charged with exaggerated piety, ancestral superstitions, and constant fears for his fragile health. He was not a child like the others. His physical development was alarmingly slow and abnormal. The expectations placed on his frail shoulders were, however, immense. He was the last male heir of his dynastic branch, the only and faint hope of the House of Austria in Spain. But with each passing day, the evidence of his intrinsic fragility became more painfully apparent. Foreign ambassadors accredited to the court of Madrid sent their respective sovereigns devastating reports on the health of the future king, dispatches that were read with eagerness and calculated concern in the chancelleries of Paris, Vienna, and London, for the future balance of power on the European continent depended, to a large extent, on the life of that frail child. Even then, the great powers were beginning to sharpen their diplomatic and military knives, anticipating the succulent feast that the division of the immense but weakened Spanish monarchy could mean. Even before he could comprehend the magnitude of the crown that awaited him, Charles II's fate seemed sealed by the mistakes of his ancestors and the ambitions of his contemporaries. It was a destiny woven with the dark threads of blood, political intrigue, and a deep, unfathomable, and prophetic loneliness. The first omens of his final ordeal were already looming over his innocent head, crowned with suffering. The coming of age of Charles II, formally reached in 1675, when the young man turned 14, did not, by any means, herald the long-awaited dawn of a firm and renewing leadership that could lift Spain out of the stagnation in which it found itself. How far away was the harsh reality of such vain hopes? It was, rather, a legal formality, the nominal transfer of a scepter that, in practice, would continue to be wielded by other hands, more experienced or simply more ambitious. His mother, Mariana of Austria, although officially removed from the regency, continued to exercise considerable influence from the shadows, now supported by a new figure rising in the courtly firmament. Fernando de Valenzuela, a character of noble origin, ambitious and astute, who knew how to win the favor of the Queen Mother and, through her, of the young and impressionable monarch. Charles, physically weak and clearly intellectually inadequate for the complexities of government, was a malleable figure, a king in the making whose will was easily bent by the stronger and more determined personalities around him. And in the Spanish court of the late 17th century, a hotbed of intrigue and ambition, there was no shortage of characters willing to impose their will. The first major crisis of his personal reign soon erupted, testing his limited ability to maneuver. Don Juan José de Austria, the illegitimate son of his father Philip IV, and the famous actress Maria Calderón, popularly known as La Calderona, was a man of considerable personal charisma, surrounded by a certain military prestige obtained in previous campaigns, and supported by an influential faction of the Castilian nobility, dissatisfied with the government of the Queen Mother and the growing influence of Valenzuela, whom they despised as an upstart. Fed up with what he considered a harmful drift for the monarchy, Don Juan José marched on Madrid in 1677 and, in what was a barely concealed coup d'état, seized power, forcing Mariana of Austria into exile in Toledo and bringing about the downfall of Valenzuela, who ended his days in exile in Mexico. Charles II, barely 16 years old, witnessed these palace intrigues with a mixture of adolescent fear and perhaps a glimmer of hope. His half-brother, Don Juan José, presented himself to him and to the kingdom as the savior of the monarchy, the providential man who would bring order to the administrative chaos and restore lost prestige. During his brief reign, which lasted barely 2 years, he attempted to introduce some administrative and fiscal reforms, and above all, he was concerned with the education and physical and mental well-being of the young king, trying to distance him from the oppressive and superstitious atmosphere that had dominated his childhood. However, his authoritarian nature, his inability to achieve tangible economic results in the short term, and the persistent opposition of sectors of the nobility who did not forgive him for his illegitimate origins, soon began to undermine his popularity. Furthermore, the fundamental problem, the issue that obsessed the court and the European chancelleries, remained unresolved: the succession to the throne. Ah, succession. That word echoed like a funeral dirge in the gilded but cold halls of the Alcázar. To ensure the continuity of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain, it was absolutely imperative that Charles II marry as soon as possible, and most importantly, produce a male heir. The European courts, always attentive to the royal marriage market, began to propose candidates. Finally, partly due to the influence of Don Juan José, who sought closer ties with France, the chosen one was Maria Luisa of Orléans, niece of the powerful Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. A young princess described by chroniclers as beautiful, lively, intelligent, and full of charm, she arrived in Spain in the autumn of 1679. The marriage was celebrated with great pomp and circumstance, and for a brief time, it seemed that a new era of optimism was dawning for the monarchy. Charles, according to contemporary accounts, fell deeply in love with his young French wife. She, in turn, brought a breath of fresh air and joy to the stagnant and gloomy Spanish court, although she would soon clash with the rigidity of protocol and the hostility of certain anti-French sectors. But the shadows, as was customary during the reign of Charles II, soon reappeared with renewed intensity. Don Juan José de Austria, the strong man of the kingdom, died suddenly in September 1679, just a few months after the royal wedding and before the new queen arrived in Madrid. Some, of course, whispered that he had been poisoned by his enemies, although the most likely cause of his death was a sudden illness, perhaps a stroke. His disappearance from the political scene returned power to the most conservative factions of the court, and eventually allowed the Queen Mother, Mariana of Austria, to return to a position of considerable influence, although she would never regain the preeminence of her years as regent. Meanwhile, in the royal bedchamber, the silence of sterility became increasingly deafening. Months turned into years, and the long-awaited heir did not arrive. The pressure on the young Queen Maria Luisa was immense, almost unbearable. She was blamed in whispers, subjected to all kinds of folk and supposedly scientific remedies, and her menstrual cycles were scrutinized with a sickening anxiety that spread throughout the palace. And beside her, sharing her anguish, was Carlos, a king deeply in love with his wife, yes, but also a man increasingly aware and tormented by his own inexplicable inability to father children. His health, always precarious, continued to cause him constant headaches. He suffered from recurring fevers that left him bedridden, chronic digestive problems that made it difficult for him to eat, and a deep melancholy that was accentuated with each new dynastic disappointment. It was in this context of marital frustration, physical fragility, and growing despair that the idea of a spell began to take hold. If the medical science of the time, rudimentary, empirical, and riddled with ancestral superstitions, could not offer a rational explanation for the king's infertility and his multiple and persistent ailments, could it not then be the work of the evil one? Could it not be the result of dark forces, of spells cast by hidden enemies of the crown, or by foreign powers eager to see the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty so they could divide up its spoils? The exaggerated religiosity that permeated the court and which characterized Charles himself provided fertile ground for the proliferation of such beliefs. The king's confessors, figures of enormous influence on his mind and decisions, began to speak more and more openly of the possibility of demonic possession, of a curse that affected not only the monarch's body, preventing him from having children, but also his ability to govern with clarity and firmness. The first shadows looming over Charles were not only those of physical illness or political intrigue, they were also, or at least so they were perceived and interpreted, shadows of a spiritual, demonic nature. The king, who had grown up in an environment where the miraculous and the diabolical were considered tangible and everyday realities, clung desperately to this supernatural explanation. If he was bewitched, then he was not to blame for his sterility or his constant suffering. He was an innocent victim, and as such, he needed to be freed from this evil influence. Thus began, discreetly at first, the first attempts at exorcism, rituals that over the years would gain in intensity, publicity, and macabre spectacle, turning the king into the unwitting protagonist of a drama that mixed faith, superstition, and despair. Meanwhile, the vast Spanish Empire continued its slow but inexorable decline. The economy remained mired in a deep crisis, with the royal coffers chronically empty and fiscal pressure suffocating the peninsular kingdoms. Spain's military might, once feared throughout Europe, was weakened by a lack of resources and a series of defeats at the hands of the expansionist France of Louis XIV, who took advantage of every opportunity to erode the borders of Spanish territories in Flanders, the Franche-Comté, and Catalonia. Charles II presided, with increasing impotence, over a weakened kingdom, a giant with feet of clay that was teetering dangerously. His decisions, when he managed to make them himself without being influenced by his ministers, his mother, or his wife, were often erratic, late, or ineffective. The complexity of state affairs and the management of a transoceanic empire far exceeded his limited preparation and intellectual and physical abilities. The young king, who had ascended to the throne with the vague hope of restoring the lost greatness of his lineage, found himself increasingly trapped in an intricate web of court intrigues, international pressures, and above all, in the prison of his own sick body and a mind increasingly besieged by fear, melancholy, and superstition. The first shadows of his tragic end loomed, dense and threatening, over his figure and over the future of the entire Spanish monarchy. The downward spiral had only just begun its inexorable turn. The years passed relentlessly, and the initial sparkle that the youth and charm of Maria Luisa de Orleans had brought to the gloomy Spanish court gradually faded, not through any fault of the queen, but because of the cruel and unbreakable sterility that marked the royal marriage. Each month that passed without the long-awaited news of a pregnancy was a new twist in the personal torment of Charles and in the collective anguish of a kingdom that saw in the absence of a direct heir the harbinger of future calamities. The weight of the crown, already overwhelming for his frail shoulders, became more unbearable with each dawn that did not bring the promise of a successor. And with it, the despair of the king, and of all those who depended on dynastic stability, deepened like an open wound that would not stop bleeding. Palace intrigues, an endemic evil in the court of the Habsburgs, intensified to the point of reaching levels of true poison. The court was divided into increasingly bitter and hostile factions, mainly grouped around the interests of the two great European powers that aspired to inherit, or at least obtain a good share of, the vast and coveted Spanish Empire, the Bourbon France of Louis XV, and the Holy Roman Empire, represented by the Austrian branch of the House of Habsburg, headed by Emperor Leopold I, Charles's cousin. Every ambassador, every Spanish grandee, every influential clergyman played his cards with cunning and determination, whispering self-serving advice in the king's ear, trying to influence his political decisions, and, above all, the crucial and increasingly urgent question of succession. Charles, with his natural indecision exacerbated by his illness and lack of education, became the passive epicenter of these fierce power struggles, often without fully understanding the complex and subtle diplomatic and courtly maneuvers being woven around him. Ugh, how difficult, how impossible it must have been for such a fragile man, haunted by his own inner demons, to navigate such turbulent and treacherous waters. The figure of his mother, Mariana of Austria, remained a constant presence in his life, sometimes an emotional support in his loneliness, at other times a source of additional pressure with her own political agenda and her preferred candidates for succession, generally leaning towards the Viennese branch of the family. But the greatest personal tragedy for Charles, after the ongoing frustration of not being able to bequeath his crown to a son of his own blood, was yet to come, dealing him a blow from which he might never fully recover. In February 1689, after a brief but devastating illness, some contemporaries spoke of acute appendicitis. Others, unsurprisingly, in an atmosphere poisoned by suspicion of possible poisoning, Queen Marie-Louise of Orléans died. She was only 23 years old. For Charles, it was a devastating blow. He had sincerely loved his French wife, who, despite not having given him the heir the kingdom demanded, had been a loyal and affectionate companion, perhaps the only person who had offered him genuine, selfless love in the cold and calculating atmosphere of the Alcázar. It is said that the king, plunged into a deep and dark depression, frequently visited her grave in the Pantheon of Infantes in El Escorial, and that his already precarious health suffered greatly after her death. What a misfortune, he must have exclaimed on countless occasions, contemplating the immense void that the death of his beloved Maria Luisa left in his life and in his heart. But the relentless reason of state knows nothing of prolonged mourning or broken hearts. Barely a year had passed since the death of Maria Luisa, when, in May 1690, Charles II remarried. The diplomatic machinery had worked quickly to find a new candidate. This time, the chosen one was Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess belonging to the House of Wittelsbach, sister of Empress Eleonora Magdalena, wife of Emperor Leopold I. It was hoped, with renewed anxiety, that this new union, with a woman from a family known for its remarkable fertility, would resolve the pressing dynastic problem once and for all. Mariana of Neuburg, however, was a woman of a very different character from her predecessor. She was ambitious, haughty, politically active, and unlike the sweet and conciliatory Maria Luisa, possessed a strong temperament and a clear and undisguised inclination towards the Austrian faction at court, which from the outset made her an enemy of the pro-French party. Her arrival at the Spanish court only exacerbated the political tensions and intrigues that already existed, and once again, to the despair of the king and the kingdom, the miracle did not happen. The years passed, relentless, and Mariana of Neuburg's womb remained as barren as that of the late Maria Luisa. The new queen, frustrated in her hopes of motherhood and fearful of being repudiated or losing her influence if the king died without naming her regent or clearly favoring the Austrian candidates in the succession, became increasingly active and often clumsy in the political struggles at court. She surrounded herself with a trusted clique, composed mainly of Germans from her entourage, which increased the suspicion and hostility of the Castilian nobility, who viewed the influence of these foreigners with disfavor. Meanwhile, the belief in Charles's spell not only grew stronger, but took on increasingly grotesque and desperate overtones. Exorcisms became more frequent, more public, and more humiliating for the monarch. Fray Froilan Diaz, the royal confessor, a Dominican who enjoyed great influence over the king's mind, together with other clergymen and supposed experts in the dark arts and demonology, subjected the unfortunate Charles to all kinds of extravagant and terrifying rituals. He was given nauseating concoctions made from unlikely ingredients. Sacred relics were placed on his sick body, and endless incantations were recited in macaronic Latin in his presence. In a paroxysm of superstitious desperation, they even exhumed the corpses of his ancestors, including that of his own father, Philip IV, so that the king could gaze upon them directly in a macabre and theatrical ceremony that, according to its promoters, was intended to break the supposed curse that gripped him. Imagine the scene. A king, already deeply tormented physically and psychologically, forced to confront the rotting remains of his ancestors in the cold, silent gloom of the royal crypt at El Escorial. These inhuman practices, far from alleviating his ills or bringing him the long-awaited heir, only aggravated his delicate physical and mental state, plunging him into constant terror, deep melancholy, and confusion bordering on madness. Charles himself, in his overwhelming despair and profound ignorance, clung to these supernatural explanations with the faith of a drowning man. It was undoubtedly easier and less painful to believe that an external and evil force was to blame for all his misfortunes than to accept the harsh and humiliating reality of his own deficient nature, of his biological incapacity. It is said that in moments of particular lucidity, or perhaps of greater emotional torment, he would cry out that he was possessed by the devil, that he felt the palpable presence of the evil one inside him, twisting his guts and clouding his judgment. His body, increasingly deteriorated and consumed, became the visible and pathetic stage for this supposed spiritual struggle. He suffered from generalized edema that swelled his limbs into shapeless masses, frequent and violent convulsions, chronic digestive problems that caused uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, and such extreme general weakness that he was bedridden for long periods, unable to attend to the most basic affairs of government. Meanwhile, the government of the kingdom was adrift, like a ship without a rudder in the middle of a storm. Ministers and advisers, divided by their own ambitions and loyalties, tried to keep the heavy ship of state afloat, but the lack of clear leadership and the constant and unbearable uncertainty about the succession paralyzed any meaningful reformist initiative. Spain continued to lose territory and prestige in each new war with the France of Louis XIV, who waited with strategic patience for the final outcome of Charles II's personal tragedy. The economy was a disaster, with galloping public debt, a devalued currency, and agricultural and industrial production in sharp decline. Administrative corruption was rampant at all levels, and popular discontent, although contained by inertia and fear, was growing underground but steadily. The weight of the crown, which had been imposed on him by birth, crushed Charles II mercilessly. It was a crown he had never really wanted, for which he had been neither physically nor intellectually prepared, and beneath whose apparent brilliance lay overwhelming loneliness, constant suffering, and a deep sense of failure. The decisions made in the distant past, the blood ties of his grandparents and great-grandparents, now returned like vengeful specters to torment him in his sleepless nights and days of prostration. The intricate and suffocating web that fate, and his own unfortunate dynasty, had woven around him was closing inexorably around him. And at the center of that web, like a fly caught in a spider's web, a sick, frightened, superstitious man, increasingly isolated from the real world, gazed with glassy eyes into the unfathomable abyss of his own irremediable decline. The shadow of the executioner, whether it was disease, a spell, or simply cruel nature, loomed long and menacing over his final years. As the 17th century rushed towards its end, dragging with it the last vestiges of Spanish hegemony in Europe, Charles II's health entered a rapid, unstoppable, and irreversible decline. Each new ailment, each feverish crisis, each episode of prostration was interpreted by attentive observers at court and by European chancelleries as an unequivocal sign that the end was near, that the long and painful agony of the last Spanish Habsburg was coming to an end. And then, when it seemed that the king's physical and spiritual torment could not intensify any further, when the atmosphere in the Alcazar had become almost unbreathable due to the tension and uncertainty, a series of events and decisions occurred that marked a point of no return, sealing not only his own tragic fate, but also that of millions of Europeans who would soon be swept up in the whirlwind of war. The death of his mother, Mariana of Austria, in May 1696, although it may have brought Charles a certain liberation in some respects, by removing a source of pressure and constant influence in his life, also left him even more isolated and vulnerable to manipulation by the various court factions vying for power, and above all, control over the will of the dying monarch. Mariana of Neuburg, his second wife, then redoubled her efforts, often with a clumsiness and greed that proved counterproductive, to ensure that the balance of succession would definitively tip in favor of the Austrian side, eagerly promoting the candidacy of Archduke Charles, second son of Emperor Leopold I. Her excessive ambition and her methods, often blatant and undiplomatic, earned her the antipathy of large sections of the Spanish nobility, and according to some contemporary accounts, even of the king himself, who in his last years came to feel a deep aversion and distrust towards her. But the real tragic turn of events, which precipitated the final crisis and turned the succession issue into a ticking time bomb, was not another death in the royal family, but the growing and distressing certainty, even for the most optimistic or those most interested in prolonging the situation, that Charles II would die, and die soon, without having produced any direct descendants, and, what was even worse, without having clearly, formally, and irrevocably designated a successor to the throne. International pressure then became suffocating, almost unbearable. France, with the astute and powerful Louis XIV at its head, was not going to allow the vast and still desirable Spanish Empire to fall entirely into the hands of its traditional Austrian rivals without putting up fierce resistance. The Sun King, with his characteristic diplomatic skill, insistently promoted the candidacy of his grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, who also had dynastic rights to the Spanish throne through his grandmother, Maria Theresa of Austria, wife of Louis XIV and sister of Charles II's father. Oh, cruel and ironic fate! The king's martyred body, that battlefield where for decades the most diverse physical ailments and the supposed attacks of demonic forces had been waged, became in his last months the parchment on which the great European powers wanted to write, with the ink of diplomacy or war, the political future of the continent. The doctors, many of them more charlatans than scientists, continued to subject him to absurd, ineffective, and often painful treatments that only further weakened his already exhausted body. Exorcists, led by the ubiquitous Fray Froilan Diaz, persisted in their rituals and incantations, going so far as to convince the confused and impressionable king that his first and beloved wife, Maria Luisa de Orleans, had bewitched him on behalf of the French court to prevent him from having children, and that his second wife, Mariana of Neuburg, was also involved in witchcraft for the same purpose, but this time to favor the interests of the House of Austria. Paranoia, delirium, and profound mental confusion took hold of the monarch in his final days. Let us imagine for a moment the oppressive and almost surreal atmosphere that must have reigned in the royal chambers of the Alcázar. A dying king, prostrate on his bed, surrounded by clergymen who spoke to him of demons and possessions, of doctors who purged him, bled him, and administered repugnant concoctions to the point of exhaustion, and of a swarm of courtiers, ministers, and ambassadors who besieged him day and night, each vehemently defending the rights of their candidate to the throne, pressuring, scheming, and pleading. It is said that Charles himself, in a fleeting outburst of despair or perhaps ironic lucidity, once exclaimed, "Many times they have given me poison, and God, in his infinite mercy, has turned it into food and health for my body." His mind, clouded by illness, a mortal fear of death and eternal damnation, and probably by the effects of the drugs and potions he was being administered, oscillated erratically between moments of surprising clarity and periods of deep prostration, apathy, and confusion. The point of no return, the moment when Charles II's personal tragedy became definitively intertwined with the fate of Europe, was reached when the monarch himself, fully aware of the extreme gravity of his condition and the terrible storm looming over his kingdom after his death, was forced by circumstances and pressure from those around him to take the most momentous and difficult decision of his entire reign, to formally name an heir to the Spanish crown. But who to choose? The French candidate, the young Philip of Anjou, thereby perhaps guaranteeing the territorial integrity of the empire under the powerful military protection of Louis XIV, but risking the independence and identity of Spain, which could become a mere satellite of France? Or should he lean toward the Austrian candidate, Archduke Charles, thus maintaining the traditional dynastic alliance with the Viennese branch of the Habsburgs, but almost certainly facing a devastating war against a France that would not accept such an outcome without fighting to the end? Renowned theologians, eminent jurists, and members of the Council of State were consulted. The pressure from all sides was immense, intolerable. Cardinal Luis Fernandez de Portocarrero, Archbishop of Toledo, and a figure of enormous political and moral influence at court, became the main and most skillful advocate of the French option, arguing pragmatically that only France possessed the military power necessary to defend the integrity of the vast but vulnerable Spanish Empire against the ambitions of other powers, such as England and Holland, which in fact had already secretly divided up the territories of the Spanish monarchy in two previous partition treaties, signed without even consulting or informing Spain. What a final humiliation for an empire that, although in decline, still considered itself the greatest and most powerful in the world. Finally, tormented by physical pain, confused by intrigue, weakened to the extreme, and according to numerous testimonies, manipulated and pressured until the last moment by Cardinal Portocarrero and his supporters, Charles II made a decision. On October 2nd, 1700, with a trembling hand and a surely clouded conscience, he dictated his final will. It was a moment of almost unbearable tension in the palace, a moment that would be etched in the annals of history. The exact contents of that momentous will were kept in the strictest secrecy for several days, but the die was cast. From that moment on, the course of European history would change irrevocably. The unfortunate king had signed not only the designation of his successor to the throne, but, without fully realizing it, the sentence of a long and bloody war that would cast a pall of mourning over the fields of Europe for more than a decade. His soul, or what remained of it after so many years of suffering, seemed at that moment to begin its slow and final descent into the abyss. He had fulfilled, in his own painful way, the last and most terrible duty imposed on him by the crown. But peace, the peace he so longed for, did not come for him. All that remained was to wait for the end, surrounded by shadows, whispers, and the stench of his own progressive physical decay. The spell, if it ever existed beyond the minds of the superstitious, was about to claim its last and most illustrious victim and unleash its most disastrous and lasting consequences on the world. The last night was approaching. The last days of Charles II, in that gray, cold, and ominous Madrid autumn of 1700, were an indescribable ordeal, a physical and mental torment that no one, not even his worst enemies, if they were aware of his innocence, would have wished to witness. His body, which for almost 39 years had been a walking catalogue of ailments, a living encyclopedia of the defects of his lineage, began the final battle, an unequal and agonizing struggle against death that was already looming over him with the certainty of the grim reaper. The court physicians, with their impotent science and outdated remedies, bustled around his bed, applying poultices of strange ingredients, performing bloodlettings that only weakened him further, and administering nauseating potions that churned his already battered insides without offering any relief. Poor king. Every breath was a supreme effort, a death rattle that heralded the failure of his lungs. Every lost gaze at the canopy of his bed was an empty echo of what had once been the faint hope of a declining empire. Prostrate in his chamber in the royal Alcazar, a space that had become his prison, and now his anticipated catafalque, surrounded by a handful of faithful servants who still owed him loyalty or compassion, by clergymen praying fervently for the salvation of his soul, and by the inevitable court vultures who waited with ill-concealed impatience for the final outcome to secure their positions in the new order that was coming, Charles was crumbling, literally falling apart before our eyes. The chronicles of the time, especially the confidential dispatches sent by foreign ambassadors to their respective courts, are a chilling, almost forensic testimony to the magnitude of his agony. He suffered from high and persistent fevers that consumed him, generalized edema that swelled his limbs until they were grotesquely deformed, depriving them of their human form, bilious vomiting and bloody diarrhea that left him exhausted and dehydrated, and such extreme weakness that he could barely move in his bed or utter a word. "He is rotting alive," a French diplomat wrote bluntly in one of his secret reports, with a harshness that chilled the blood and reflected the terrible reality. The stench in the royal chamber, according to all accounts, was unbearable, pestilent, despite the incense that was burned continuously and the perfumes and scented waters that were used, in vain, to mitigate the foul odor of disease and decay. It is said that his body was covered with sores and purulent ulcers, especially on his back and limbs, the result of immobility and poor circulation. His mind, once beset by ancestral fears and superstitious delusions, was now clouded by the delirium of agony and the palpable imminence of death. At times, in brief and sporadic moments of lucidity, he would ask in a faint voice about some long-forgotten matter of state, or simply mutter prayers learned in his childhood, clinging desperately to the Catholic faith that had been his only constant, though often insufficient, comfort in a life marked by physical torment and spiritual loneliness. Cardinal Portocarrero, who had become the zealous guardian of the secret will, hardly left his side, ensuring with cold determination that no last-minute influence, especially from Queen Mariana of Neuburg and the Austrian faction, could alter the dying monarch's final wishes. The queen was, in fact, kept at a calculated distance during the last days, accused by some of the supporters of the Bourbon option of having tried to poison the king in the past, or of wanting to manipulate him on his deathbed to change the will in favor of his nephew, Archduke Charles. The atmosphere around the royal bed was one of unbearable tension, a macabre vigil where the fate of Europe literally hung on the last and agonizing breath of that unhappy and consummated man. In his final moments, as life slipped away like sand through his fingers, Charles II is said to have made a superhuman effort to utter a few words that have been engraved in the memory of history, words that sum up with heartbreaking simplicity the tragedy of his entire existence. "Everything hurts," a concise, direct phrase, almost childlike in its sincerity, but laden with suffering accumulated over decades of hardship. Not only did his body ache, ravaged by disease and inbreeding, his soul ached, branded by loneliness, misunderstanding, dynastic failure, the inability to live up to the expectations of his rank, and the unbearable weight of a crown that had been for him more a crown of thorns than a symbol of privilege and power. Finally, in the early hours of the morning of November 1st, 1700, All Saints' Day, a date laden with religious symbolism, Charles II of Habsburg, the last king of his glorious and ill-fated dynasty in Spain, breathed his last and final breath. He was 38 years old and had lived almost 11 months of a life that was a slow death. His death, although long expected and announced, deeply shocked the kingdom and all the courts of Europe. Silence fell over the royal Alcazar, a heavy, dense silence, filled with uncertainty, fear of what was to come, and perhaps, for some, a secret relief. The enchanted king, the martyr king, had ceased to suffer. The last night was over. The day of revelations and consequences was beginning. Immediately after the chamber physicians certified, with the solemnity required by the occasion, the death of the monarch, and once the bloodless body of Charles II had been simply shrouded, one of the most momentous and eagerly awaited events of that fateful day proceeded without further delay, the official opening of the royal will. The anticipation in the halls of the Alcazar, where the principal ministers, the grandees of Spain, the members of the Council of State, and the ambassadors of the most interested powers had gathered, was at its height, almost palpable in the dense air charged with contained emotions. And the surprise, or for some the dreaded confirmation of their worst suspicions, was enormous, with an impact that would resonate for years in the chancelleries of Europe. Charles II, in his final disposition, dated October 2nd of that same year, named as his universal heir to all his kingdoms, states, and lordships, both in Europe and in the Indies and the rest of the world, Philip, Duke of Anjou, second grandson of His Most Christian Majesty, Louis XIV of France. The will did, however, impose one crucial condition: that the Duke of Anjou, once crowned King of Spain, formally and forever renounce any right of succession to the French throne, both for himself and his descendants, in order to avoid the dreaded personal union of both crowns under the same sovereign, a prospect that terrified the rest of the European powers, especially England and Holland. In the event that Philip of Anjou or his descendants were unable or unwilling to accept the Spanish inheritance under these conditions, the will established an alternative line of succession, naming Archduke Charles of Austria, second son of Emperor Leopold I, as second in line. It was a diplomatic bombshell with incalculable consequences, a masterstroke by the pro-French faction led by Cardinal Portocarrero, who had managed to twist the dying king's will at the last moment. The reaction of the Queen Dowager, Mariana of Neuburg, and the supporters of the Austrian cause was one of dismay, rage, and disbelief. Voices were raised accusing them of manipulation, coercion, and even forgery of the will, but it was too late. The decision was made and sealed with the signature of the deceased king. While news of Charles's death and the contents of his will began to spread like wildfire throughout Madrid and via urgent couriers throughout Europe, an autopsy was performed on the royal corpse, a common practice at the time to determine the cause of death, and in this case, to satisfy the morbid curiosity surrounding the monarch's legendary poor health. The findings of the doctors and surgeons who performed the dissection, recorded in a detailed report, revealed a bleak, almost monstrous picture that confirmed the magnitude of the suffering he had endured during his life and the profound degeneration of his body. They reported that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, atrophied and weak. His lungs were corroded and full of adhesions. His intestines were gangrenous in several places. His kidneys were inflamed and full of stones. They found only one testicle, small and black as coal, which explained his infertility, and most strikingly, his head was filled with a large amount of water, which today would be known as hydrocephalus, a broken body, consumed from within, incapable of having harbored a full and vigorous life, let alone having begotten one. The curse of the Habsburgs, the terrible flaw of inbreeding practiced for generations, was manifested in all its rawness on the cold and bloody dissection table. Those macabre findings seemed to provide a scientific explanation, albeit post-mortem, for many of the ills that had been attributed to witchcraft and demonic possession. The body of Charles II was then subjected to a complex embalming process, intended to preserve it for public display and subsequent transfer to the royal pantheon. For several days, his mortal remains were displayed on a catafalque in the Hall of Ambassadors of the Alcazar, where thousands of Madrileños, from the humblest to the most exalted, filed past to bid him their last farewell, in a mixture of curiosity, grief, and fear for the uncertain future that lay ahead. Finally, with all the funeral pomp befitting a king of Spain, the coffin was transferred in a solemn procession to the royal monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial, where it would find its final resting place in the pantheon of kings, alongside his glorious, and, in many cases, also unfortunate ancestors of the House of Austria. But the death of Charles II, as would soon be seen, was not the end of the story, but the bloody and tumultuous beginning of a new and turbulent chapter. The king's body had barely grown cold when the first sparks of the succession crisis began to ignite. Imminent chaos loomed over Spain and Europe. The death of Charles II, which occurred in the solemn early hours of November 1st, 1700, did not bring the peace and stability that some naively hoped for, but rather the long-heralded storm. As feared in the chancelleries of half of Europe, and perhaps as some strategists secretly desired in order to take advantage of the turmoil, his will in favor of Philip of Anjou, grandson of the all-powerful Louis XIV of France, almost immediately triggered the conflagration known as the War of the Spanish Succession. Emperor Leopold XII of Austria, head of the Viennese branch of the Habsburgs, refused to accept the Spanish king's last will and testament under any circumstances, considering that his house's rights to the Spanish throne were preeminent and that the will had been obtained under duress. He therefore claimed the crown for his second son, Archduke Charles, who was proclaimed Charles III of Spain by his supporters. England and the United Provinces of the Netherlands, the great maritime and commercial powers of the time, fearful of the imbalance of power that a France united dynastically with the vast Spanish monarchy would entail, and seeing their commercial interests in the Mediterranean and the Americas threatened, they quickly formed a grand alliance with Austria to oppose the enthronement of Philip of Bourbon. For more than a decade, from 1701 to 1714, the European continent bled in a brutal and exhausting conflict fought on multiple fronts. In the fields of Flanders, in the valleys of the Rhine and Danube, on the plains of Italy, and of course with particular virulence, on the Iberian Peninsula itself. Spain was plunged into a painful civil war, with entire regions such as Catalonia, Aragon, Valencia, and Majorca siding mainly with Archduke Charles, the Austrians or Imperials, while Castile and much of the rest of the country supported Philip V, the Bourbons or Felipistas. The battles of Almansa, Brihuega, and Villaviciosa, among others, marked the path to the consolidation of the new dynasty with Spanish blood. When the guns finally fell silent after long and complicated diplomatic negotiations with the signing of the treaties of Utrecht, 1713, and Rastatt, 1714, the political map of Europe had changed forever, and the Spanish monarchy had paid a very high price for the resolution of its dynastic crisis. Philip V was internationally recognized as King of Spain and the Indies, but in exchange for significant territorial concessions that led to the definitive breakup of the European empire of the Spanish Habsburgs. Spain lost all its possessions in Italy, Milan, Naples, Sardinia, and Sicily, which passed to Austria and Savoy, respectively, and in the Netherlands, which were also ceded to the Austrian emperor. In addition, and this would be a wound that would bleed for centuries, it had to cede to Great Britain two strategic enclaves of enormous value, the stronghold of Gibraltar and the island of Minorca. The empire where the sun never set was drastically reduced, confined essentially to its peninsular territories, the adjacent islands, and its vast but increasingly ungovernable and coveted overseas territories in America and Asia. The glorious Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled Spain for 2 centuries, from Charles IV to Charles II, thus came to a melancholic and definitive end, being replaced on the Spanish throne by the French House of Bourbon, which would usher in a new era in the history of Spain, with its own lights and shadows. The legacy of Charles II is, therefore, at first glance, a legacy of ashes, blood, and territorial losses. His reign is often remembered, and not without reason, as a period marked by political and economic decline, administrative paralysis, rampant superstition, and the personal incompetence of the monarch. However, to reduce his complex and tragic figure to that of a simple, inept, degenerate, and sick king would be to fall into an unfair and superficial historical simplification. He was, above all, and perhaps above all else, a victim of his terrible genetic inheritance, the result of centuries of disastrous endogamous marriage policies, a victim of the excessive ambitions of the European powers that surrounded and pressured him, a victim of the medical ignorance and superstition prevalent in his time, which turned his body into a testing ground for absurd remedies and humiliating rituals, and, ultimately, a victim of an absolutist political system that placed an impossible burden on his fragile and inadequate shoulders. His life, and above all his death, are a dark mirror that harshly reflects the dire consequences of dynastic inbreeding, the intrinsic fragility of absolute power when it falls into inadequate or sick hands, and the horrors to which superstition and fanaticism can lead when they mix in a toxic way with affairs of state. His story reminds us, with tragic eloquence, that behind great political decisions, wars that redraw borders, and treaties that seal the fate of nations, there are always human beings with their primal fears, their intimate pains, and their personal tragedies. Charles II, the Bewitched, was perhaps the last and most unfortunate link in a long chain of mistakes, ambitions, and fatalities that had been accumulating for generations within his illustrious but exhausted dynasty. His lonely agony in the Alcázar of Madrid was the painful prelude to a new era for Spain and Europe, but also the grim and twilight epilogue of an empire that refused to die completely, even though its heart, like that of its last Habsburg king, was barely beating. And so, the heavy marble slab closed over the remains of Charles II in the crypt of El Escorial, but his story, that of his tormented life and momentous death, resonates to this day, like an echo in eternity, reminding us of the vanity of earthly power, the relentless fragility of the human condition even at its highest pinnacles, and the deep underground currents that often shape the course of history in unexpected and terrible ways. What do you think about this ending, about this life marked by suffering and fatality? Was Charles II a mere puppet of fate, an insignificant pawn on the great chessboard of European politics? Or was there in his tragic existence some glimmer of free will, some spark of humanity that official history, often focused on great events and not on small dramas, has forgotten amid the cold accounts of spells, decadence, and wars? I invite you to leave your thoughts and feelings in the comments. And if these chronicles that delve into the darkest and most moving corners of history challenge you, move you, or make you think, subscribe to our channel, follow us with your like, and share this story so that more restless souls can learn the truths, often bitter, that lie hidden behind the veils of time. Together, we will continue to uncover the echoes that history has left in eternity.